One of the biggest criticisms of psychedelic research is about how the profound perceptual effects of these substances can lead to unblinding, which refers to when a participant can guess that they received the psychedelic treatment and not the placebo control. And this unblinding has been criticized for inflating outcomes and complicating interpretation in the gold standard study design, the randomized controlled trial. And this is often termed the placebo problem. But what are we getting wrong here, and how do we overcome this issue that appears to be hindering clinical research and regulatory progress? Hello, and welcome to the integration session, where we explore the science, stories, and future of psychedelic science. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Balázs Szigeti, clinical data scientist at UCSF's Translational Psychedelic Research Program, who is a leading voice on the topic of the placebo problem. From his roles in highly cited psilocybin trials to pioneering self-blinding citizen science studies, Balázs has been at the forefront of rethinking how and what we measure in psychedelic research. Today we're going to explore placebo and nocebo effects, the broader issues with randomized controlled trials, and what the future of rigorous evidence in psychedelic science might look like. Let's dive in. Hello, Balázs. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the Integration Session podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you've worked on some major trials in the psychedelic science space, including the psilocybin escitalopram trial. So can you tell me how you came to focus on the more methodological side of the field and where your interest came in terms of the placebo problem and how to overcome it?
Yeah, sure. So my way into psychedelic science was the self-blinding microdose study, which came out a while ago at this point. It was in 2021. And this was a citizen science study where we've developed a method how people at home can implement their own placebo control. And I don't want to get into the details, but very briefly, people used non-transparent gel capsules to hide their microdoses. Empty capsules were placebos, and everything was labeled with a QR code. And there was this long process that you needed to follow. And we uploaded these instructions in a video format online that people followed. And at the end of it, you were discarding some of the capsules, kept the other half, but you did not know if it was the placebo bit or the microdose bit. But with the QR codes that you scanned during the setup process, that linked with the IT infrastructure of the study, so we did know what you are taking. And that was really my first psychedelic study ever. And the reason we did it this way is because I tried to apply for regular clinical trial funding for microdosing, but I just wasn't successful. So I was very frustrated, and that frustration, bleed into this innovation of the self-blinding methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, here the idea is that this was one of the first placebo-controlled studies on microdosing. And this is still one of the largest, or actually not one of the, it is the largest placebo-controlled study of microdosing even to date. And here we have noticed an interesting pattern, and that is that what seems to be mattering a lot more is what people think that they have taken, rather what is it that they have actually taken. So something that we measured in this study is an instrument called PANAS, the Positive and Negative Affection Scale, and it's kind of like the how are you doing scientific version. It is going through a list of emotions, and and one of the most interesting analyses that we did with this is that if you look at this, the outcome of this PANAS, we measure this every day, and every day we ask you to take a guess whether you have taken a placebo or a microdose. And what we did is that we analyzed the data in a sort of 2x2 matrix. And one of the dimensions is that what is it that you have actually taken, the actual drug condition, and it was either a placebo or a microdose, and what was your guess that you have taken, what is it you thought you have taken, and also placebo microdose. So if you have taken a placebo and you thought you were taking a placebo, then the score on the PANAS scale was about 13 points. That's the baseline, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
If you have taken a microdose but you thought it was a placebo, then it was 13 and a half, something like that. A very minor difference, statistically non-significant minor difference. And the interesting bit is that if you have taken a placebo but you thought it was a microdose and the score went up to 19, and if you have taken a microdose and you thought it was a microdose, it was about 20. So basically we can put these 4 data bits into 2 buckets, the lows and the highs, but it does not go with the drug condition, it goes with what you thought you were taking, placebo or microdose. So this is where this whole interest is coming from, is that that we can, that what seems to matter is not what you have actually taken, but you think you were taking. And it seems that it matters already a lot for microdosing, but for various reasons I kind of I lost my interest in microdosing. I don't think it's very effective. So then I sort of brought this thinking and these questions over to macrodosing, which I personally find a lot more promising from a medical perspective.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Such a creative way to get around the traditional clinical trial study design. I really find that interesting. And yeah, it goes to show how powerful placebo effects can be. So I have a quote here. You stated in one paper that more data on placebos are available from placebo-controlled trials than on any treatment in medicine. So how do you define the placebo and the nocebo effect, just so that we're on the same page in terms of terminology?
So to me, it is the expectation of a benefit or the expectation of certain effects. It can be negative as well if you're including the nocebo effect as well. But kind of like the placebo effect is like the self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you're thinking that an intervention is going to have a certain effect, then the probability of those effects actually occurring are increasing. And that also includes, for example, side effects. You can induce side effects via nocebo mechanisms. And there is this weird thing in the medical literature that we use placebo as kind of like this standard baseline against which we are measuring all of these interventions. And we have more data on placebo than on any other intervention, yet we are keep measuring it. Everybody is talking about that, how expensive is drug development, and I think that is a legitimate concern. And one thing that I'm right nowadays thinking a lot about is that why don't we just use the data that we have on placebo from other trials? So as I said, we have measured it hundreds of times, and you can draw what is the distribution of placebo responses for, let's say, depression, if you're running a depression trial. If you run a single arm study and your effect size is, let's say, larger than the 90th percentile of the placebo effects that we have measured, to me personally, that would be good enough evidence that whatever is your intervention is not just a placebo effect. Now, it's not perfect, of course, because it's lacking randomization and how to put it, I am not, what I just pitched, I understand it comes with limitations, but what you gain with, or sort of what you lose in terms of the science, I think you gain a lot more in terms of being practical and the cost saving and all of that comes into effect. And one thing that I must want to flag here is that, of course, the issue is that a lot of the studies are just pretending to be placebo-controlled. There is a big difference between following a placebo-controlled procedure and versus your study actually controlling for the placebo effect. Because the following the procedure means that you are not telling the patients what they are going to receive. But of course, from side effects or other factors, patients can often realize that what was their drug condition. And this is the notorious problem with psychedelics, that it's really, really easy to distinguish placebo from, let's say, 200 micrograms of acid, or LSD. That's a pretty obvious difference in experience with those two conditions. So, the issue is this, that we are pouring a lot of money and resources into placebo-controlled studies, but actually many of them are not even really placebo-controlled. You're just following this placebo procedure. So I think, there is kind of this weird thing where we are treating the placebo-controlled studies as the gold standard. And I think, it's scientifically solid. I'm in favor of placebo-controlled studies. But it turns out that in practice, running placebo-controlled trials is incredibly difficult because most drugs are going to have some sort of a side effect. Then why are we still sticking with this evidential standard? If this is a standard that, which it's impossible to run trials where this standard can be met, then I think we need to change the standard to just find other ways of grappling with this problem, because it seems to me is that I think in English it's called the story of the three fairies, right? When you run into a fairy and you got three wishes, and the first wish is that put an axe into a tree that nobody can pull out, and then the next wish is to pull out. We created this evidential standard for what is we are creating the gold standard, but it turns out that at least in the realm of psychiatry, this is just an evidential standard that most interventions cannot meet. And importantly, that does not mean that these effects are just placebo effects. It just means that we have a hard time gathering evidence proving that they are not just a placebo effect. But that does not mean that they are just a placebo effect. I want to be clear about that.
Yeah, definitely. That's so interesting. And we'll get into sort of the alternatives, and maybe the double-blind RCT is not the only form of valuable evidence. But you mentioned there the amount that is therapeutic effect versus placebo effect. And what does the current literature say on those different amounts? How much of the effect that we see in psychedelic macrodosing studies do we think is expectancy or placebo effects?
So here's I'm gonna answer this in a very roundabout way, but I promise you I'm gonna answer your questions. But I want to give some background knowledge, which I think often gets lost, particularly if you're not a clinical data scientist.
Yeah.
So let's say you're running a study with two arms, and then in that study there are three effects that you can measure. The first one, the technical term, is the within-arm effect of the control condition, and that is the difference between the baseline scores and the endpoint scores in the control arm. So that is basically how much patients have improved in the control arm. Then you have the same quantity in the treatment arm. And then the third one is something that's called the between-arm difference, or sometimes often called the treatment versus control difference. And that is like how much better is your treatment relative to the control condition that you're having in the study. And what's important to note is that 95% of the scientific literature is just focusing on this between-arm effect. If you look up any random clinical trial, it's very likely that you're not even going to find information about the within-arm effect, the patient improvement. The whole biomedical literature and the way the FDA is approving drugs is solely based on the between-arm difference, how much better you are than placebo. With traditional antidepressants, when you're treating depression, this difference is about 2 to 3 points on the Hamilton Depression Scale, which is the standard questionnaire for measuring depression. With psychedelics, it's about 6 to 7 points, and this large difference between these two between-arm effects is the reason why people have been very excited about the promise of psychedelic medicine. See, there is a much larger between-arm effect, so patients are doing much better. It turns out that's not the case, because what's happening is that in psychedelic studies, there is a significant chunk of the placebo responses is missing. So let me elaborate on that. So the placebo response, which is this within-arm effect of the control condition, with traditional antidepressant studies, that is about 8 to 9 points on the aforementioned Hamilton scale. So the total patient improvement is the placebo response plus this treatment versus control difference. Just add those two up, and that's going to be your patient improvement in the treatment arm. So in this case, it's about 8 to 9 plus 2 plus about 2 and 3. So you're going to land somewhere between 11 to 12 points. That's the patient improvement with antidepressants. With psychedelics, it turns out that the placebo response is only 4 to 5 points. It's basically about half of what we are seeing in the traditional antidepressant studies. So now what you need to do is to take the placebo response, 4 to 5 points, and add to it the between-arm effect, which is again about 6 to 7 points. And again, you're landing somewhere between 11 and 12 points, which is the same as for traditional antidepressants. So when you're looking at the between-arm effect, which is again what is regulators and most scientists are looking at, then psychedelics seems to be much, much better. But it's not because patients in the treatment arm are doing much better. It is because in psychedelic studies, the placebo response is much smaller than in any other intervention, not just with traditional antidepressants, but also in brain stimulation studies or with ketamine interventions as well. There just seems to be kind of like this missing placebo response, And what does that mean is that the between arm effect is measured against this much lower floor, leading to this very large between arm effect. But that is not due to, again, the patient improvement after the intervention. Is due to the lack of patient improvement in the placebo arms of these studies.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you found in the psilocybin escitalopram trial?
So no, this I would say this is kind of like more just like putting together the big picture. There is
Yeah.
not a paper where we talk about this a lot, although the my most recent paper, it was in JAMAP Psychiatry, where we did, it's a meta-analysis work, and it is where we are comparing open-label traditional antidepressants against psychedelics. And here the idea is that psychedelics are practically always open label, which is the technical term for when patients know what they are getting. So we said that, okay, they are practically always open label, therefore we need to, the fair comparison is if we are comparing them against other open label interventions. So we compare them against open label traditional antidepressants, and what we have found is that there is no difference between the two. But once we dug deeper into the data, we realized that the reason we find this result has nothing to do with the open label nature of the antidepressant studies. It is only because we looked at the patient improvement after the treatment rather than this between arm difference. Every other meta-analysis that's out there in the literature, and of course, there are hundreds of meta-analysis papers out there, but I really do think that ours is maybe the only one which is going to look at the within-arm effect, so the patient improvement and not this between-arm difference. And that is the reason why we got the results that we got, is because our study kind of ignores this depressed placebo response effect.
Mm-hmm.
And right now there are some people who started to talk about it. It's not just me, but I think people are finally realizing that this is actually a big methodological issue. It leads to these misleading results that you're measuring, again, the effect against this missing placebo response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was asking about the psilocybin escitalopram because you found in this study that the psychedelic therapy may be less vulnerable to expectancy bias than was previously suspected. So I was wondering if you could comment how that ties in here.
Sure. So in that study that you are referring to, what we did is that we looked at the possible correlation between baseline expectancy and the clinical outcomes in that study. And interestingly, what we have found is that in the escitalopram arm, we find a correlation that you would expect. So the higher the baseline expectancy is, the more the improvement was there in the escitalopram arm. But we did not find that correlation in the psychedelic arm.
Mm-hmm.
But as they say, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we did not find evidence for a significant correlation, it does not mean that there is no relationship between the two. And statistically speaking, it means is that when we are running this test, we are trying to reject the null hypothesis, but failing to reject the null hypothesis is not the same as confirming the null hypothesis. And the statistical tool to do that is something that's called equivalence testing. And we did that in the paper, and that turned out to be failed as well. So what does actually mean is that the data was inconclusive. The null hypothesis in these cases is that there is no relationship between expectancy and the clinical outcomes, and we could neither reject nor confirm that relationship. And the reason how it ties into this bigger picture is that when we talk about psychedelics, a lot of people talk about expectancy effects and patient bias and all these sorts of stuff. But everybody was thinking that it affects the psychedelic arm. Mm-hmm. Everybody thought that people who realize that they got the psychedelic, they are going to be kind of boosted by these expectancy effects. They know that, they are the cool kids of the block, on the block, they got the psychedelics. But it turns out that actually what seems to be affected a lot more by functional unblinding is the control arm. There's a lot of, what I'm saying right now, I would say this is a working hypothesis. I would not,
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of not proven, but I would say that based on, the evidence and the data out there in the field, it seems that positive expectancy effects in psychedelics and other treatments are minimal, but it seems to be that these expectancy effects matter a lot in the control conditions. And the best case for this is coming from studies of ketamine. I think this is worth going into because it's super cool. So with ketamine, just like with psychedelics, if you're using an inactive placebo as your blinding agent, then it's going to lead to functional unblinding. But with ketamine, you can also use a drug called midazolam, another anesthetic drug, as an active placebo, and it turns out that blinding is much improved in those studies. It's still not perfect, but it is much, much improved. So what's really cool with ketamine is that we can compare the outcomes of completely unblinded studies where an inactive placebo is used and actually blinded studies when this midazolam is used as a control condition. And it turns out that if you're looking at the patient improvement after ketamine, there's a marginal difference between the blinded and the unblinded studies. So blinding did not make a difference when it comes to the efficacy of the ketamine intervention. However, in the control conditions, when in the unblinded studies there is kind of like this, so in the unblinded studies there is a missing placebo response, but in the blinded study, so where midazolam is used, there is a proper placebo response. So like, blinding did not make an improvement after the ketamine intervention. Blinded or unblinded, ketamine roughly has the same effect. But the control condition, the placebo effect, behaves very differently in the blinded and in the unblinded study. In the blinded study, there is a normal-looking placebo response, but in the unblinded, there is basically zero placebo response. So again, this kind of like feeds into this theory or hypothesis that the field is converging on, that these effects matter in a control condition, not in the treatment condition. And again, the reason why this is important is because this between-arm effect is that's something that everything that we are basing on. So, like, this between-arm effect only makes sense if there is a relatively steady baseline that you are measuring it against. But it turns out that it's a lot more variable than people have assumed it.
So how do you recommend that we think differently then about the clinical trial design? Should we be measuring all three of these effects, or is there a different alternative?
So, like, as I said, at the top of the show, like, I think scientifically running placebo-controlled studies is a solid idea. But it turns out that in some areas of medicine, like psychiatry, it's incredibly difficult to do it in practice. Like, think about the space of all possible interventions in the realm of mental health. It includes drug interventions like SSRIs, kind of like weird mixtures like psychedelics that have a drug component, but also therapy. Of course, there is therapy, there is meditation, and like forest bathing right now is popular, or like exercise-based interventions. Like those are all possible interventions that we are testing in psychiatry. But the whole placebo control concept only makes sense for pharmacological interventions, because there I can give you either an active pill or an inactive pill. So that's kind of like already a small subset of all the interventions that you are interested in. And it turns out that even within pharmacological interventions, what you actually care about, or sort of where placebo control works in practice, that's even smaller. So what's strange to me is that, yes, placebo control is a good scientific idea. I'm willing to die on that hill. But if we cannot run placebo-controlled studies in practice that are actually placebo-controlled on the vast majority of interventions that we are interested in, then I think we need to change how we are evaluating the drugs. And like I have, the other thing which I think is important that people often forget is that I said everything is based on the between-arm difference in these studies. But that's not the patient improvement. Like, call me crazy, but if you're doing medicine, I think patient improvement is supposed to be kind of at the center of it. But like, the current evaluation frameworks, we just care about this treatment versus control difference, not about the magnitude of the patient improvement. And like, I think like, that needs to be a part of this picture. Like, of course, patient improvement matters if you're about developing effective medications. And like, another part of it is that I'm not a therapist. I'm a clinical data scientist. Like, I don't I don't treat the patients, but like, sometimes I talk to them. And of course, like, I've been a patient myself. nobody cares about whether they get better because of the placebo effect or like a true drug effect. Like, we are running this trial on chronic back pain, and like, nobody is going to complain that, like, if it gets better, that hey, it was only just a placebo effect. So there is this weird thing where the regulatory agencies and the scientific literature fixates on something that is, I think, again, it's kind of like definitely a part of the picture. Like, this between arm effect is clearly captures something scientifically important, but it's completely irrelevant to patients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. There's sort of this like separating the drug and its effects from the context and the expectation and all of the things surrounding it, which also have an impact on patient outcomes. Um, but what about the importance of determining that specific effect? Because I guess what would be the risks of relying on the placebo effect or trying to harness that when it isn't the true drug effect? If you know what I mean.
So I think, this is where, like, let's say homeopathy, and like that's a good example that we have run, hundreds of trials on. That might be an overestimate, but at this point there is a consensus in the field that homeopathy is just a placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
Then the risk that you're running from the regulator's perspective, and this is particularly important in Europe, where there tends to be like a one-payer healthcare system, that you're paying for an ineffective medication, right? Like, it still costs money, homeopathy, but it's not effective. But I think where there is a little bit of a misunderstanding here is that, like, homeopathy not being better than placebo, it does not mean it's not effective. It just means it's not more effective than an already effective intervention, the placebo intervention. And the important point here is that the placebo effect is not for free. You need to elicit the placebo response. So, it is, as I said, the placebo effect is kind of like an expectation of a benefit. You need to do something that you think is going to make you feel better. So from my perspective, something like homeopathy, even if it has zero specific effect, that does not mean you are paying for an ineffective medication. It means that you are paying for a placebo effect, which can be pretty powerful. So, like, there is some tension there, and like, I don't have all of the answers. I tend to be leaning towards kind of like we need to move past this current paradigm where everything is just based on the specific treatment effects, and we need to loosen it up and be more open to harnessing the placebo effect and putting patient improvement more at the center of how to evaluate these drugs. I actually have a little anecdote here that I would like to share because it's
Yeah.
so I was it happened a few years ago, and I was flying from my hometown Budapest to New York. Obviously a very long flight, and I had a little ear infection, and like, especially like this long flight, like air pressure difference, it was just like really painful. So when I landed in New York, I went to the first pharmacy that I could to get some drugs for it. But there was only homeopathic eardrops available. I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna waste my money on it. So I was just, going out of the pharmacy. But then I was like, but man, it really hurts, and I really wanted to get something. And obviously, I'm a researcher in this area, so I'm like hypersensitive to these topics. And but I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I need to set aside my scientist brain for a second, and I went on my phone and started to read about positive reviews about homeopathy. And I was really trying to convince myself, buy it. Oh yeah, like this is the real deal. Like, it helped this guy and that guy. So I went back to the pharmacy, bought a homeopathic eardrop, and actually it helped. Like, again, I am like hyper, like, or like, I'm very knowledgeable about these topics, but I managed to convince myself into a placebo effect. It genuinely helped. The next day I still went and, saw a proper doctor who gave me antibiotics that, like, took care of it in the long term. So like probably if I would have kept like treating it with homeopathy, the outcome would have been worse. But it helped me to get through that difficult night. So the point that I just want to raise again is that the how powerful these effects can be, but that also it's not for free. Like, you need to elicit the placebo response.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I guess like the challenge there would be just making sure that an individual isn't choosing this placebo intervention over one that's already effective and proven. Like if there was a different drug in the drugstore that you could have taken that was shown to be effective against placebo, you probably would have been better off with that one. Is that right?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. I still think that medications should be evaluated, but that if something is not better than placebo, I just want to highlight that doesn't mean it's
Mm.
worthless. It's a little bit the same with the microdose study that I started with, and there we have shown that microdosing is not better than placebo. And it was 2021, and I got a lot of crap from the psychedelic community for that
Mm.
study. And I was weird because to my mind, what we have shown is that psychedelics microdosing worked because there was a statistically significant within arm effect. Like microdosing has improved well-being and depression scores relative to the baseline in the microdosing group. There's no doubt about that. We showed that very clearly. It's just that it was not better than placebo. So if you're talking to old school scientists, then what you're going to focus on is this lack of difference from placebo. And what I was focusing on is the patient improvement, the within arm effect, which we showed that it works. And there was a lot of tension there because I thought we showed that microdosing works. It just happens to be that the magnitude of the effect is not larger than the placebo effect. But a lot of people focus just on this much more traditional view of evaluating clinical trials, which is just based on this between arm effect.
So it's sort of a matter of perspective and looking at that traditional placebo versus treatment versus the individual and their baseline to endpoint changes.
Yeah, and I think both has value. Both has
Yeah.
value. I am not saying that the within arm effect is all there is to it. And
Mhm.
again, I very strongly believe in placebo-controlled trials if we can actually run studies that are placebo-controlled. The worst
Mhm.
case where you can end up is actually kind of like where we are with psychiatry, where we are pretending that these studies are placebo-controlled, but actually there's a lot of functional unblinding because it gives us this false sense of objectiveness, but in reality it's not there. It's kind of like faked objectivity. And but on the other hand, I feel that there is a lot of tension in the culture of psychiatry around this because we have basically generations of MDs have been raised that the difference between psychiatry, which is proper medicine, and psychology, which is woo-woo, is kind of like the placebo-controlled studies. And I think that's very deeply entrenched into psychiatry. Psychiatry has a long and hard time fighting for legitimacy as a scientific discipline and something that is not just kind of like woo-woo stuff. And running these placebo-controlled trials is a very strong element of that. So a lot of people in the field are not receptive to some of my ideas around it because they see this as kind of okay, now we are going back to sort of the pre-placebo controlled
Mm.
era of psychiatry where we can be the objectivity can be questioned. And I'm a little bit yeah, but you are just pretending to be objective. You are still not objective. It's better to be honestly subjective than pretending to be objective. That's at least my view of it.
That's so interesting. And how do you think that those tensions are sort of amplified specifically in the psychedelic space? Because I know you've published a lot on comparing psychedelics to similar unblinding conditions and different ways to sort of look at that. How do you feel that the response and the criticism might have been even more intense from those communities, if that's the case?
So So here's the thing is that, as I said, functional unblinding, that happens with most other drugs as well.
Hmm.
Let's take SSRIs. Well, actually, first, let me go back one step. That the way typically we are measuring blinding integrity is that we ask patients at the end that, hey, take a guess what you have taken. Were you in the placebo group or the treatment arm? And if patients are guessing at a chance level, then they should get it right about 50% of the time. So that correct guess rate equals 50% in a two-arm study. That's what you're aiming for. That's that patients are not being able to guess it better than random. With SSRI studies, it is about 60%. The correct guess rate. So there is a 10% difference compared to the ideal. But with psychedelic studies, it's about 90 to 95%. So there is functional unmasking in most psychiatric studies as well, but the magnitude of the problem is much larger with psychedelics. Previously, psychiatrists' attitude was just to, basically put their hand into the sand and pretend that this problem just does not exist. But the problem is so big with psychedelics that, like, that strategy no longer works. But it's lead to this weird thing that, okay, then are we going back now and reevaluate SSRIs and, like, are we like demanding not perfect blinding? But then, like, we would need to start overloading psychiatry. That doesn't really work either, like, because it gets into these legitimacy issues that I was mentioning about it before. But like pretending that it does not matter, that's no longer an option because the issue is too large with psychedelics. So that's not kind of like the right way either. So like, we are trying to figure out, I think, a way forward where like psychiatry can still be like, we don't need to revise all of the old drugs, but something where it also deals with the problem where it's at least as large as with psychedelics. So that's how I see that.
Yeah. And bringing in sort of the political or the regulatory implications of this, obviously, regulatory bodies like the FDA uphold these double blind randomized controlled trials. So, do you see a future where they like tend to value more like pragmatic or these alternative ways of looking at the research?
I think they are kind of like forced to. Like, I don't know how quickly that adaptation is going to be. And bear in mind, it's like bureaucracy. Like, things tend to happen very slowly in that space. But I definitely feel that, like, the FDA now, they are trying to really speed up drug development and make it easier for drug developers. And as a part of that movement, I see that they are going to consider more pragmatic trials. Like, for example, in the Compass Pathways, who is probably the biggest player in the psilocybin space right now, they just published about a month ago their phase 3 top-line results. And like, if you look at the study materials that they have released, it's all about the between arm effect. There was a statistically significant difference, and like, that's what they are focusing on, and rightfully so. Like, that's what the regulator cares about. But if you look, there's this complete missing placebo response. So in one of the phase 3 studies, I mentioned that typically it's like 8 to 9 points, the placebo response. In the COM005 trials, one of their phase 3 studies, it was only like 1.2 points. So instead of the 8, 9, it's basically 1 point. And then the between arm effect, it was 3.6. And that's what the press release is focusing on. But that means that the patient improvement was about 1.2 plus 3.6, so about 5 points. Which means that it is about the patient improvement after psychedelic therapy in the Compass trial was basically about half as big as the placebo response in non-psychedelic studies. Like, those Compass 3 data, it's really strange because their stock value went up because according to this regulatory framework, there's a statistically significant between arm effect, which looks kind of like not super impressive, but like, on the better side when all things considered. And because of that, like, everybody is really, really happy. But if you know how to look at this data, then you see that it's kind of like a substandard placebo. Like, that's how effective the medication is, which is really, really strange because then this is what the FDA is going to approve, and like, this is how they are going to make money. It's a strange situation. Like, if I would be the FDA myself, like, I'm like, it's not a huge secret that I'm sympathetic towards psychedelics, but when I saw the results of those 2 trials, like, it really made me stop that, like, what the heck is going on here. Yeah, so like, it's a complicated topic.
Yeah, definitely. And how do you think that we kind of reconcile that? I think you mentioned at the beginning, like, pulling together our knowledge of the placebo intervention and using that to compare to treatment arms instead of having each study have its own placebo control. So do you think that that could be a future direction here, or other trial designs that maybe are better at controlling for placebo effects? Or what do you see as like a good recommendation for researchers to develop this space?
So I don't think there is going to be like one design that like answers all of the problems. I think we need to like, hit it from different angles. And one of them is, I think there is certainly something to that like, hey, let's just kind of like, look at like in the distribution of placebo response, where is the efficacy of the treatment? And if it's in, let's say larger than the 90th percentile, then I do believe it's not just a placebo effect, even though if you would talk to somebody like a formal statistician, like, it lacks randomization, like, how to put it. I'm cheating here. Like, I'm not saying this is perfect, but again, I just kind of feel like what we gain practically is worth the scientific price.
Mm-hmm.
But here is the other thing, which I think is kind of important, that let's say that you have a medical condition and you go to see your MD. I think you and most patients would be interested in two questions. One of them is that, am I better off waiting for this condition to get better, or should I start taking medication A? And the other question is that, am I better off medication A or medication B? Right? Like, those are the questions that you're interested in. Nobody is interested in the question that, okay, this is going to be a mouthful, but hopefully I'm not going to screw it up. Am I better off taking this medication but not knowing whether I take the medication or placebo? That's what the placebo-controlled trial answers, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not a patient-facing question. Patients are not interested in that. Patients are interested, am I better off just like waiting or taking medication A? That's a waitlist control trial. The other question is, am I taking of medication A over medication B? That's a head-to-head comparison trial. So kind of like, what we have at the center, the placebo-controlled study, that's again just like that's not something that patients care about, or like, it's not really relevant to them. If you are, somebody like myself, like a data science geek, you care about this, but it is like most patients, it's not relevant to them. So I'm really warming up to the idea of waitlist controlled studies, because this is something that it answers a question that's relevant to healthcare, that's relevant to patients. Like, is this condition likely to go away, or like, just get better over time, or you should start taking the medication? And like, waitlist has a bad reputation in the literature because it tends to be kind of like have like small effect sizes. But I think, a lot depends. Like, waitlist control is kind of like, it can mean a lot of different things. And I think, what is key here is that if you are telling patients that they are in the waitlist, it has a negative connotation. You did not win the randomization lottery. But you can also run a waitlist controlled study where you are not telling it's a waitlist. You are just saying that, like, hey, you are going to get the treatment, but you're going to get it in 8 weeks because our therapists are busy in the meantime. Like, there's a big difference, me telling you that, hey, sorry, like, you are on the wait list, we're going to treat you, but only 8 weeks later, versus, yay, you are going to get the treatment, but we are super busy right now, so you're only getting it in 8 weeks' time. So, like, how exactly you set up the wait list, I think that's important because, with this, we haven't hit on it when we talked about the missing placebo response in psychedelics, but I think it's important to mention that we think it is due to something that we are calling the nocebo effect, like knowing that you are in the placebo control condition. Like, it leads to this patient disappointment that you lost the lottery of the randomization, as my colleague at Stanford, Boris Heifetz, like to say. And again, like how we are phrasing the waitlist, are you a winner of the randomization or you are a loser of the randomization? I think, that would make a difference. Anyway, the point that I wanted to make is that I kind of think that like waitlist control studies are undervalued, and there is a lot of variability in how you can set up waitlist control studies. And I think if you are like kind of trying to maximize all of the effects in the waitlist control studies, then we would see much bigger effects even on the waitlist control than in some of the other studies that are out there at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That's interesting. Thank you. And what are you working on at the moment? Are you planning any waitlist control trials?
No, I mean, not at the moment, like not personally, but we're doing a follow-up to, I mentioned the open-label antidepressants versus psychedelic studies, and now we are going to do another comparison of blinded SSRI study versus psychedelics. But again, we are going to focus on the patient improvement rather than the between-arm difference. And minor spoiler, and I have like 90% confidence in it, not 100, but there's not going to be a difference. I haven't finished all the data extraction yet, but like, I'm through it mostly, and at this point, just like, looking at the numbers, strongly my hunch is that there's not going to be a difference there either. So I would say, like, that's kind of like, when I'm mostly busy with right now. And, here at UCSF, we are, full steam running the a study on a controlled study on psilocybin for Parkinson's. I would say that's probably the flagship study at the point, because of course, like, it's Parkinson's. It's not kind of like depression. I kind of feel like, psilocybin for depression, we've done that enough. Like, it's kind of like it's hard to get excited about it. But psilocybin for Parkinson's, like that's a neurodegenerative disease. That's just something completely new, and hence the excitement about it.
Yeah, very exciting. Well, thank you for providing that insight into the research you're doing and providing your insights on the broader placebo problem in psychedelic science. It was really a pleasure to speak with you today, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much for tuning into this conversation with Dr. Balázs Szigeti. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics, Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.